Hi, we move today into a new chapter, 1 Samuel 17, the long and famous and complex story of David and Goliath. And you can see on the right side of the screen in the pink box in the much smaller print, this is the third of the three stories we've been looking at that introduced David to Saul and to the Israelites. And the small print shows you how much longer this story is. In fact, I've only put on the screen there 10 to 37, and the whole story really is the entire chapter and perhaps into the beginning of chapter 18 as well, depending upon how scholars set it out. So that's one thing we have to take account of, is what is this much longer story doing there? And there are many parts of the story that before we get into it, which I'm going to do in this video, is just do these overview questions that we have to consider. Because although it's such a familiar story, perhaps its familiarity is one of the limitations on being able to hear it. One of the things that we'll look at eventually is how Malcolm Gladwell in a TED Talk has shown exactly that in his own understanding, that he talked to an audience about how much he thought they understood the story, but when you look at it up close, everything he thought about it was wrong. And so we have to be able to look at our own cultural lens as well as some other aspects of the story. So before we jump into it, let's look at some of those issues to consider as we go. One is textual, and at least if you've been watching some of my videos, you know at least that the Hebrew Bible was written in Hebrew, of course, but there's also a tradition of it in Greek known as the Septuagint, which is from the 3rd or 2nd century BCE and a course of development in Egypt and probably in Alexandria when the Israelite community, the former Judahite community more technically, was in Egypt and needed a text that used the language that they spoke there, which would have been Greek in the time after Alexander the Great. And so that's when the Septuagint developed. But the Masoretic text, the one that scholars use for translation, is actually refers to the Masoretes, who were the scribes and translators not translators, I'm sorry, the scribes in the medieval age, in the 12th or 13th century. And so, with some irony, the Hebrew text that people use for translation and study is 14 or 1500 years more recent than the Septuagint. The only Hebrew Bible texts we have that are older than the Septuagint are the maps from the Dead Sea Scrolls. There are other scraps, but the Dead Sea Scrolls is the major piece of it, and the Dead Sea Scrolls is not all of the Bible. So scholars historically argue about the relationship between the two sets of texts. But in our story, it makes a bigger difference because 20 verses at least that are in the Masoretic are not in the Septuagint. Let's look at that just briefly as an overview. So you can see here in small print, I'm not expecting you to read this, that the bold parts are the parts that are in the Masoretic and not in the Septuagint. And of course, this is all in English, so some of the translation might be different, but this is from the New Revised Standard. So you see this whole big chunk about David and his brothers and his family. It was not in the Septuagint. All this from verses 11 through 31. And then there's some other specific places where there are little sections, including this very end piece where Saul and Abner talk about David. So which of those stories should we be reading? Well, maybe we should be reading both of them. So let's look at a way to see how that affects the shape of the story here in this chiastic structure. It's a loose chiasm here, so I put chiastic shape. But when we look at the big picture, we see it starts and ends with the setup of the valley and then the aftermath in the valley, using the Hebrew word gai in both places, and only those two places in 1 Samuel, setting up the framework. Then the B part in verses 8 to 11 is the Philistine taunting Israel, and then the B1 part is the mutual taunting between the Philistine and David. And then I have two C parts. Sometimes chiasms do have paired C parts, and sometimes they don't. So scholars sometimes have ABC C1 B1 A1 versus ABC B1 A1. But here the difference is the C part here is the part that's only in the Hebrew, and the part here is the part that's in the Septuagint and the Hebrew. So if we didn't have the Hebrew, it would go straight from the Philistine taunts Israel to David and Saul prepare for battle, and then continue down here. So the Septuagint is a chiasm without this part, and the Hebrew puts this part in here, which works as a chiasm because this is the only section in the whole story that David is with his family, and there's some personal relationship there with David. So either way, whether we read it with the Septuagint or not, it forms this chiastic shape. But how we interpret the story will make a big difference on whether we include the Septuagint only or whether we read the Hebrew together with it. And we will be following the Hebrew, but I'll be noting the options as we go. Other issues to consider here as we look at this story as we start. Beyond the textual differences are the cultural and modern differences. For example, if you look at the Merriam-Webster dictionary definition of Philistine, you see this. And research shows that the origin of Philistine use as and uncultured or anti-intellectual goes back to the 14th century. It probably got popular in intellectual culture in the 19th century with the use of Matthew Arnold, making Philistines people who are unsophisticated, as he took himself to be. In other words, people who had to study the texts and theories that Arnold had studied. But of course, then it got to be used as the way the Romans used barbarian to describe others out there who are not like, quote unquote, us, because they're not cultured. And that goes back to many ancient empires, including the Roman and others, that type others, as the Romans did, as barbarians, as people who are closer to animals than to humans. And yet the Philistines were not that at all. If anything, as we'll see, not just in this passage, but throughout 1 Samuel and in 2 Samuel, the Philistines were certainly in some ways more sophisticated than the Israelites. They had a political organization of 5 cities that worked together, and we'll see the lords of the Philistines that David ends up working for and then leaving later, having worked for them. And they have organized armies, and they have the sophisticated tools and skills for smithing and making swords and things. So in other words, they're fully into the Iron Age, but the Israelites in our story are not, using sticks and slings and things like that as weapons, as we're going to see in this story. So the cultural understanding that we might have of the Israelites of being like us, because modern Israel exists and modern Philistia does not, is probably backwards. That the Philistines were more sophisticated in many ways than the Israelites were. But they're certainly othered in this story by nothing else than calling them consistently uncircumcised. But also there are aspects of Goliath in particular that we'll see that are othering him as a representative of his people. Another aspect to look at here, my number 3 note, is the many echoes of ancient Greek culture, including Goliath's array of weapons and the tradition of single combat to resolve international conflict. As soon as we get into the scene here, and we can see this once the armies are set up on opposite sides, we see this long description here of Goliath, both his height, classically 6 cubits in a span, and then all the things that he used to protect himself and as weapons. Many readers just take those for granted, but the fact is that those are not Israelite weapons. And although it says that Saul offers David his suit of armor, we'll have to look a little more closely at what's going on there. But what this leads many scholars to see is that there's Greek influence here, and we could go down many rabbit holes around that question. I don't intend to do that here. But one of the big issues is who were the Philistines in relation to other peoples of the time. The people who've done the most on the Philistines are the Dothans, and their archaeological work and more relatively recent summary has set the stage for other work that's followed them. And so the Dothans certainly point out, consistent with the consensus before they began their research, that the Philistines were sea peoples, and often they're simply referred to in general as sea peoples, like the Phoenicians that were headquartered in Tyre and Sidon, and the word Phoenician and the word Philistine come from a similar root. Another word that comes from those roots is Palestine. And so we see the tradition of sea empires and sea peoples throughout the region, including the broad category of Aegeans and people on Crete. Obviously, if you live in an island and you're going to interact with the mainland of Greece or Italy, you need to be sea-born people for that as well, whether for trade or for military purposes. And consider all the other islands out there, major islands that were populated, like Sicily as well. So what I'm not going to do is get into the historical question of what period of Greek influence shaped the writing of this story. As I said in the introduction of the entire David story at the beginning of chapter 16, scholars range from, over a course of 800 years, from contemporaneous with the events in the story from roughly the 10th century BCE all the way down to the Hellenistic era in the 3rd century BCE as the time when either the story was written or edited or put into the form we have it here. I'm not going to get into that, but the Greek influence is undeniable, and one way to look at it is that the Greeks were mercenaries for the major inland empires when they came to the Mediterranean. So whether that's for the Assyrians or for the Babylonians, we see evidence of that. And we're going to look at a couple of scholars that help us with this. One is Azan Yadin, who's at Rutgers here, who refers in this article, Goliath's armor and Israelite collective memory will help us hearing Homeric echoes with Goliath's weapons and armor there. Another here, Michael Press, I couldn't find a picture from him, but he suggests taking the single combat tradition in Greece and wonders whether there's a tradition in the Hebrew Bible that this story sets up a parallel with other stories that make this a type scene in the sense of a story that's basic shape is repeated in other stories, much like the tradition of the cowboy western in earlier American cinema, where the cowboys wore the white hats and the bad guys wore the black hats, etc. And one more. To consider here from Ido Garfinkel, the article "The Shaft of Whose Spear Was Like a Weaver's Beam," and suggests one of the other things that we have to deal with, which is that this story in 1 Samuel 17 is not the only story of a killing of somebody named Goliath in the books of Samuel. There's another one later on in the very end of 2 Samuel, which is often understood as an appendix, and we'll see there that there's another Philistine named Goliath who's said to be killed by someone named Elhanan, and also a Bethlehemite, and Goliath is described as a Gittite, as you can see that in just the first sentence of the article on the screen there. And so scholars argue endlessly, as they do, about which came first, with most agreeing that the appendix is probably the original story and the David story is adapted from that. Again, I'm not going to try to answer that question, but we're going to let Ido Garfinkel's work at least draw some literary connections within the books of Samuel, as well as outside from other scholars to Greek sources like the Iliad as well. So another issue that we need to look at before we start is the assumption that David is the underdog. If you go to the internet and just look for David and Goliath, that's what comes up. And certainly Malcolm Gladwell's book, which you can see a cover of here, is suggesting a rethinking of the question of what an underdog is. But ask ordinary people, I'm sure, and you'll see the phrase David and Goliath as a traditional story of David the underdog, or how it is that someone who seems like there's no way they can actually win. But as Gladwell points out in great detail, and we'll look at it more as we go, that's misunderstanding the story completely. And one of the bases of that is equating David's sling with a modern slingshot. I asked my wife Sue when she pictured David's weapon, what did she picture? And she paused for a moment, and then she said something like with a fork and something stretched across it. And that's, of course, a slingshot, a kid's toy. And we wouldn't think of that as a major weapon. Certainly, you wouldn't want to be hit by a rock in a slingshot from close range, but it's not likely it could kill a warrior. But for our purpose of our story, that's not what's going on. What David used was a sling, and the book of Judges highlights that slingers could hit a hare at a great distance. And Gladwell's video, which we'll reference, helps us to rethink whether David was really at a disadvantage or not in the story. And then something I didn't put up here, but we also need to keep track of in terms of the introduction, is that at the end of our story, it seems like Saul hasn't met David at all before. He wonders, who is this boy who's taking on the Philistines? So we have to finally explore the relationship between these three stories and see whether they can be read consistently or whether it's inconsistent. Finally, one last thing about this story, highlighting not necessarily the Greek influence, but its uniqueness, is there are a number of words in the story that are either only here in the entire Hebrew Bible, or only here in 1 Samuel, or only here and maybe one or two other places. So a lot of the vocabulary is different than the vocabulary in the rest of Samuel. And yet, as my chart here highlights some key words, and you can see they're color-coded, we'll look at them in detail as we go, there are a number of words that are used many times in this chapter, as you can see, repeated words. And many scholars have also pointed out that the story is full of wordplay, one of which is the word for to fight, lechem, sounds almost identical to the word for bread, lechem, which is, of course, where David's from, Bethlehem, the house of bread. And so there'll be many word plays like that, and the translations, of course, can't show us those, so we'll look at those more as we go. So another quick thing to look at before we start is how this fits into the chiasm, and then we'll end this video and we'll do a new one getting into into the story itself. So we've moved from chapter 16 into here, and notice this whole unit, which consists of our story and the previous story of David the lyre player, and then the story of David and Jonathan that follows here, and Jonathan's love and Michal's love, is part of this whole section, which parallels the Philistines rejecting David at the end. Even without the story we have here, so if this was added later, we would not have this chiasm. We'd have Jonathan's love and Michal's love. So there has to be at least some form of the story that was old enough that whoever put the second half of 1 Samuel into this shape had this to create this shape. So even if the story is late, perhaps the chiasm was later, but it's really hard for us to analyze those kinds of things. So with that overview, we should have enough to enter into the story. And if you're confused along the way, I would encourage you to go back to this video, or perhaps if you have access to look at one of the articles I cited, which go into some of these things in more detail. And with the next video, we'll jump right in. See you then. Bye-bye.